how we formulate both theoretically and operationalize these. And then I'm going to talk a lot about the sensory motor basis of the bodily self, how sensory motor predictive processes may underlie the most fundamental aspect of the self, which is the bodily self, the self here and now. And I'm going to talk quite a bit on how this relates to psychosis, both in schizophrenia and early states of psychosis, because I think there's a very important link between the two. And finally, if we have some time at the end and you're interested, I can talk a little bit beyond the eye, or how we're kind of transitioning in my lab from studying self models to kind of models of the world and the interaction between the two. Okay, so this is the outline for my talk. And we're going to start a little bit about the self. So what is this self? I think each of us has a very strong sensation of being a self. Okay, in a way, it's one of those things which are very, very easy to understand, very difficult to define. Okay, and so my thinking of the self used to be that there was kind of one unitary system kind of building this construct. Okay, but of course, when we look at the self, we see a very multifaceted kind of construct. We have all kinds of different parts of the self. And while looking from within, the phenomenology seems quite unitary. Okay, this is me and this is my body and things are happening to me and I'm experiencing things. Okay, it does not actually seem to be that way when we look at the processes involved, both cognitive and neurobiological. Okay, so after kind of thinking about the self as a unitarian, maybe kind of a evolutionary construct, I've changed my opinion also in line with a lot of work of Thomas Metziger, and suggested that there is no real thing as a self. Okay? The self is something we feel in our phenomenology, somewhat related to consciousness, but there is no one such thing as the self. Instead, I like the proposition that there are different self models. Okay? And these self models are an interaction between our neurobiology and how the world is organized. And what are these self models? So, as for example, we have a bodily self. Bodily self is the sensation that this is me and I have a corporeal existence here in the world. There's also a reflexive self. Okay? This reflexive self allows me to think of myself both as a subject, but also as an object in a more kind of distant manner. Okay? And I can think of myself, thinking of myself. And this is very handy, this kind of reflexive self, because it allows me to do simulations. So it allows me basically to think about what might happen to me if I do something without actually doing it. And of course, we also have a social self, how we relate to other people in the world. And this is, we were talking about teenagers before. This is something which becomes very, very salient and important. And I think we're feeling very much the lack of it during the last COVID period. And over time, we also have an extended self. An extended self is the story of our life. Kind of what we tell, the most fictitious part of it is our curriculum vitae. But this is a story. So we wake up in the world, we wake up every morning, and we go back and tell ourselves the story, who I am and what I am. And of course, this is a highly flexible story. It really depends on who we're talking to at the very moment. We might change this quite a bit. Okay. And all these have one underlying point. And I think this point is very important. I think all these are aimed at reducing our uncertainty in the world. So the reason that the brain builds these sense of self is to have a more explicable world. And I'll kind of point this out in the realm of the bodily self. So once I can divide, the brain kind of in a naive manner can divide signals to those arising from within the body and those arising from outside the body and make this demarcation of a self in a world, it has already been able to reduce a lot of uncertainty about what's going on, because it knows that some of these arise from within and we have a better information about them. And some signals, we have less information and less predictive capacities about them. And this is what we call the environment of the world. Okay? So there's also, in my opinion, some hierarchy between these selves. Okay, so at the most fundamental level, we have this bodily self. The bodily self is the first to develop. It develops very early, and it's associated with specific parts of the brain, especially frontal, sensory, and body-related regions, because this self is strongly tied to our corporeal existence. Okay, this is what we call a bodily self. And after we develop this bodily self at a slightly later stage in our life, we also develop the second reflexive self, our ability to think of ourselves in an abstract manner. Of course, this is a developmental stage, which is a bit later in life. Experimentally, it's kind of tricky to tease apart, but we think it's related both kind of a little bit of default mode, but also frontal regions. It's related in some ways to the faculty of metacognition, being able to think about or represent ourselves as a second order. And then we also have social self. Social self has a representation along the default mode, but also in the temporal lobes. And finally, of course, we have the extended self, which is related to our memory or episodic parts of our memory. And this is related both to default mode and to medial temporal lobe regions of the hippocampus and thoracic cortex. Okay? And I think there's a hierarchy, and there's a reason that these kind of develop. And there's a reason that you kind of can't remember what's going on before you develop this bodily self. Because I think in a way, these are layered. Okay, so each layer of representation of the self is built upon the previous one. And as I will show later, if we kind of manipulate and perturb this bodily level of the self, we're going to see changes in other levels of representation going downstream. Okay? And in fact, when you think about experience, we have no evidence of experience when there's no sense of a bodily self. Okay, so when you go to sleep, your self goes to sleep, your kind of whole being, your consciousness is turned off, you don't feel you have a body. Interestingly, in our dreams, we also typically have an embodied representation. Okay? But when you turn it off, the whole system turns off. And I don't think, I mean, there's some discussion about meditation, whether there's some kind of pure ego ability when there's no self there to still experience something. But basically, all our experience, all our consciousness is based upon someone having these experiences. And this is the basis of the self, which allows us a sense of subjectivity. Okay? And today I'm going to focus on the bodily self, which has been being the most fundamental layer of this construct. I spend most time studying. Okay? So what is this bodily self? This bodily self at its most basic level is the ability to delineate ourselves from the environment and conspecifics. Okay? So this sounds almost trivial, okay, in the sense that why would I think that I am a table, or why would I think that I am someone else? But in my view, this only shows how robust the system is. The fact that we don't make these mistakes often shows that we have very, very strong capacity to make this delineation. Okay, now most of this bodily self is in fact implicit. We have no real sensation, and we don't put any effort into bringing these pieces together. Okay, but this feeling allows us to be within the world. Okay, so this is a corporeal feeling. This is what puts us kind of glues together our mental and spiritual side into our body. Okay, and importantly, it gives us kind of a Cartesian center of where we experience the world from. Okay, so I experience the world from this present self, and I can think what happened to me before, and I can maybe imagine what's going to happen to me later. And also distances are kind of set out from where I am here. So this being here and now in the present time is the bodily self. Importantly, this self is unextended in the temporal dimension. Okay, so if I'm imagining looking backwards, this is already not the bodily self. And how this bodily self is built is very important to us because it arises at a very, very early stage. And if there are problems with that, which is quite rare, this is a very, very bad developmental sign. Okay? And there are two main phenomenological aspects to this bodily self. One is a sensation that this is my body. So looking at this, I recognize this hand, I recognize my face, okay? And I have a sensation of an intimate sensation that this is me. Okay? And we call this body ownership. And it has been the main focus of study in most of the work on the bodily self. A second important aspect is the fact that I have control, I have volitional control over this body. And this is what we call the sense of agency. And it's also been studied quite extensively in a very, very different line of research. Okay? And indeed, there have been proposals that these two aspects of the bodily self are in fact dissociated. One of the reasons that has been the fact that we have different neurological conditions which can cause a deficit in one but not so much in the other. For instance, in somatoparaphrenia, people, usually due to stroke, to kind of frontal or parietal regions, awaken and have a sensation that their hand, okay, typically the hand, does not belong to them. Not only does it not belong to them, they usually have some form of confabulation or explanation that this arm belongs to someone else. So in this drawing, this is actually a drawing, and this mother thought that the arm belonged to her daughter. Okay. And we know that this is due to damage to kind of frontal and maybe somatosensory regions, typically creating the sensorimotor paraphrenia. Okay, so this is a deficit in body ownership, sensation that this part does not belong to me, and even some sort of kind of a delusion, feeling that it belongs to someone else. On the other hand, we have alien hand syndrome or anantic hand syndrome, in which people, also typically due to neurological damage, have a loss of sensation of control over a part of their body. They believe that this body, this hand, here you can see Peter Sellers in Stanley Kubrick's movie, they feel that this is their hand, but the actions of their hand are actually do not feel like they belong to them. And this is typically more due to frontal damage, often with damage to the corpus callosum. So we can imagine there's some problem of signals traversing and going between parts of the brain. So these kind of deficits and the dissociation between them have led to the philosophical and experimental idea that maybe these two parts of the bodily self are in fact dissociated. And indeed, experimental designs, and this is the most classic experimental design used to study body ownership. I'm sure everyone knows this, but I'll show it again. This is the rubber hand illusion, where a participant has a rubber hand stroked with his real hand. And of course, when the stroking is synchronous between the two, there is a sensation that the rubber hand belongs to me. Okay, so what's actually going on in this situation? We see a rubber hand, we feel touch on our real hand. These signals, when they match well, they create a conflict for the brain, and the brain, trying to explain away this conflict most efficiently, says, well, maybe this rubber hand in front of me is actually mine. Okay. On the other hand, the sense of agency uses kind of suddenly a different pathway to this. So when we're in doubt about our body, which I think is actually more often, implicitly, more often than we think, we can use all kinds of volitional cues to see if this is mine. So here, of course, is kind of a ad absurdum situation with Groucho Marx. But when we want to know if something is me or not, the most classical thing to do is to make a strange movement. Okay, and this movement being arising from an internal decision, internal volition, okay, would be very difficult and very unlikely that something in the environment would match it by chance. So anything matching it would probably be related to the self. Okay, and how do we quantify these measurements of the body itself? And this is a tricky one. Okay, first of all, we use questionnaires. We probe phenomenology through questionnaires. We ask people. There's very classical questionnaires that we use by now since Boddik and Cohen's paper. This is an important, maybe not fantastic way to do this. I think it's very important to use phenomenology, but also to add other converging measures, okay, which are more objective. We can use drift. So typically people feel closer to the fake limb, okay, in the synchronous but not asynchronous conditions. And we also have different measures using GSR reactions to threat, temperature measurements, or motor evoked potentials. Okay, so we have different, both the subjective and objective measurements, allowing us to quantify these changes in the bodily self. On the neural substrate side, we have already had many studies, especially pertaining to body ownership. Okay, so we of course have a neuropsychological work from brain damage patients, as well as quite a bit of fMRI work. Very few but interesting stimulation studies, and recently both some ECOG and some intracranial data. Okay, trying to understand how these different signals are brought together in the brain. Okay, so on the theoretical side, I think the kind of take-home message from the last decade or so of work is that what is happening in the brain is both exteroceptive and interoceptive signals are brought together. And when we're using agency, also efferent motor signals, and the brain is integrating these signals. Okay, the sensory signals are integrated especially in parietal and frontal regions, and interoceptive signals arising through the insula probably are also represented, and somehow these are brought together. Okay, and the correspondence between these signals is actually what gives rise to this basic sense of self. And in my view, it's not empirically tested, this is something that happens very rapidly. Okay, so I'm thinking within the first half year of our experience, okay, and probably even part of it happens prenatally, the convergence of sensory signals. So when I'm moving my hand, I get proprioceptive and tactile data and visual data if my eyes are open. And very quickly, the brain can pick up on these things. There have been suggestions that this might be a Bayesian optimal way. Okay, but the brain picks up on this correspondence of these signals, and these signals, after seeing that they often happen together, this kind of builds a model, and this has even been suggested to be a hyperprior, perhaps, the body. Okay, and this formulates the basic and most fundamental level of self, the sensation that I am here in this body. And once I'm here in this body, I can also see that outside this body, there's stuff that I predict less well. And we start calling that the world. Okay? And I think this is a critical distinction that we make very, very early on in our development. Okay? However, when you look at how this is done, this is probably done in a very different way for the sense of body ownership. So the sense of body ownership is passively kind of feeling how these signals come together. And for the sense of agency, we can use a special signal, which is our volitional signals, for which we have efferent information, and we have a better way to predict them because we're actually creating them, to make this distinction of self or other. And today I'm going to focus mainly on this part of the bodily self, the one driven by the sensorimotor signals. Okay. So that was a lot to take in. If there's a question, I'm happy to take one now. If there's not a question, I'm becoming apprehensive. Okay. If anyone has a question, feel free to chat it out or shout it out at any point. I'm happy to make this interactive. Okay. And of course, one of the most interesting ways to study this sense of self is by looking at cases in which self models are altered somehow. So I've had the privilege to study a genetic alteration. So we brought in a family from Brazil who have a supernumerary finger, which is functional. So they have another finger. And this kind of changes their self model in an interesting way. And we did some very nice brain imaging, and they're actually capable of doing a lot of stuff that we can't do. Amazing Rubik's Cube players. And some people have changed self models because of something that happened in their life. So this is Jesse, and Jesse is a dual hand amputee. And he's had surgery on one side, and in the surgery, they've pulled back their nerves from the hand, from the residual nerves, and connected them to the chest muscle. And he uses his chest muscle now to control this prosthesis. And this, of course, is a very different way than he was born. And we've looked at how this has changed his brain and the way he acts. And of course, we have people with neurological damage and psychiatric conditions in which we have very, very important changes in the self. And today I will focus quite a bit on changes in psychosis, where you can really see that the self model is altered quite a bit. Questions? Okay, good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sensorimotor basis of the bodily self. Okay. Now, these are fantastic signals. Why are these fantastic signals for self under distinction? And this goes back to Helmholtz ideas and, of course, Walper's work. And this is the most basic kind of sketch of this comparator model. But the idea is that for each motor command we emit, we get an efference copy. And we kind of predict the sensory outcomes that are going to happen due to this action. These are called forward models. Okay. And in the meantime, we're actually monitoring the actual sensory feedback, the afferent signals coming back from the environment. And through some kind of a still to be discovered mechanism, we're comparing these signals. Okay, we're making a comparison between what we predict is going to happen, what's actually happening. And then it can kind of go two ways. So if everything is happening like I expected it, I can say, well, that's what I expected is going to happen. And that's probably me. I have a good prediction for that kind of a outcome, and that's me. And if that doesn't happen, okay, so I predicted something and it didn't happen, okay, so I predicted my hand to pass in front of my face and I don't see it, then maybe something else happened. Maybe this is someone else's hand, maybe someone else pushed my arm, or maybe something else, the environment is somehow intervening and complicating matters. Okay, so this comparator model, which has been showed throughout the animal kingdom, gives us a very, very good neurobiological mechanism by which to differentiate self and other. Okay, and indeed, we now know that the comparator model is very important for the sense of agency, for the sensation of being controlled. Okay, the explicit and implicit aspect of feeling that we have control. Okay, so if I do something and I get the correct feedback, I'm in control, if not someone else. We know it is the basis for sensory attenuation. Okay, so when I touch myself, this touch feels less strong than when someone else is touching me, probably because I predict exactly how it's going to impact me. And of course, this is the same kind of reason that we cannot tickle ourselves, because we're actually predicting the tempo-spatial aspects of this tickling, and we're canceling them out. And this is the same kind of intimacy that gives the sense of self. Okay, so I know this is arising from myself, so I don't care so much, and I can attenuate these signals. And we also know that this is kind of disrupted in psychosis. Okay, and there's a very interesting aspect there, because in psychosis, a lot of the symptoms we're seeing, especially what we call Schneiderian symptoms or the positive symptoms, there seems to be a problem with this delineation between the self and the world. Okay? So we have kind of internal signals, okay, running amok and going outside. So people, maybe you can, patients often describe they feel people can hear their thoughts, kind of thought broadcasting. Or in the other direction, they often feel that someone else is controlling their actions, passivity symptoms. And our idea, and the idea presented, I think originally by Fritz, is that perhaps some problems with this kind of comparator model causes this problem in delineation of self and other, and it allows this permutability of signals, which we typically know how to keep outside. We know this is me, this is my body and mental life, and they're outside signals, but they don't belong to me. And on considering the negative symptoms, so the idea is that once this is happening, the world becomes a very confusing place. And perhaps after a while, you're not so enthusiastic about trying to act and understand what's going on. Okay. So over the past few years, I did a lot of work before that on body ownership, and I've kind of moved more into studying the sense of agency. And within the sense of agency, there's been a lot of work on expectations which are non-embodied. So very often you press a button and you see a light going on, or you press a button and you hear a sound. And those are very, very nice. But to me, in a way, they're kind of missing the real embodied and hard-coded aspect of agency. Because when I move this finger, I have really a lot of experience and a very strong prediction about how this is going to work. While if I press a button and hear a tone, I've probably either learned that during the experiment, or, so I'll give you an example that I always give. If I press the light button and the light doesn't go on, then I'm going to switch the light bulb. But if my finger doesn't extend when I want to press the light bulb, then I go to a neurologist. Okay, so this is kind of shows a little bit of what kind of expectations and the strength of the predictions we have for our bodies. So within my lab, all our work is done on embodied sense of agency. So we use a lot of virtual reality and rubber hands illusion. So there's always something which looks like a body there, because we really believe that the level of expectations and level of predictions we have for a body are quite different. So in this experiment, people kind of stick their hand under a screen and they see a virtual hand, which is of the same size and kind of the same color as the real hand. And what they do is they do like a finger movement like you see here, in each trial, one finger movement. And what we do is we manipulate the movement of the virtual hand. Okay, so what we do is we either add a temporal alteration, we delay the movement of the finger by 0, 100, 200, 300 milliseconds. We induce a small spatial alteration, or in this first experiment, we also did an anatomical alteration. So you're moving the index finger and you see a different finger move. Okay, and the idea of here going out on this first experiment was to see, is this sense of agency really one thing? Okay, or are these predictions, I mean, these type of predictions are very different. One is temporal, one is spatial, one is anatomical. Do they all tap into the same kind of processing, or are they quite distinct? Okay, and this is the work done by Amit Krugrasser, who was a PhD in my lab. Okay, so basically there's a fixation, you do one single movement, And then you have an agency question. The agency question was a psychophysical question. The question was, did the virtual hand move exactly like you move? Okay. And what we discovered is basically we could kind of sketch out a tuning curve for the self when this no longer feels like you. So in the temporal domain, we could see that kind of point of subjective equality was around 200 milliseconds. Okay. And in the spatial domain, also around 10 degrees, people started more often saying that it's not in them. However, in the anatomical, which was not surprising to us, okay, as soon as a different finger moved, people almost no mistakes. Okay, because this is kind of a categorical difference. Okay, and we replicated this in a second pre-registered experiment and found basically exactly the same kind of things. Okay, so there's a drop-off as when the alteration becomes larger. And we did a signal detection theory approach to this because we were very interested in how these different aspects relate. And what we discovered is across all these different aspects, the temporal to the spatial, temporal to anatomical or spatial to anatomical, the sensitivity and the bias were both highly correlated between these aspects. What does this mean? This means that if you're good at the temporal, you're also good at the spatial. And this is nice, but it could also mean that you just see well or you have very good visual proprioceptive integration. Okay, but not only that, the way you make a decision, your bias as to saying more yes, more me or more not me, was also correlated across this. This means that both our sensitivity, our perceptual sensitivity, but also the way we decide if something belongs to me or not, it works kind of a similar way across these different domains, despite that the underlying processing and mechanisms at the sensory level are kind of different. One requires a measurement of timing, another requires kind of a sense of which finger was moved, okay? And another looks at the spatial extent to something is conflicting with what you have done. Okay? And we then were kind of interested in looking, how does this relate to psychotic symptoms? Okay, so we gathered another group of participants and we replicated the experiment because we found these very nice kind of tuning curves, both for the temporal and for the spatial. We also looked a little bit, we had an idea that maybe they would be altered by stress, by stressing our participants a little bit. That was not super successful, okay? But we did find that overall, both the sensitivity and the metacognitive confidence were related to prodromal questionnaires probing the psychotic, underlying psychotic-like experiences in a healthy population. Okay, so the PQB was highly correlated to both sensitivity and metacognitive confidence. So on the first step of kind of the psychosis or schizophrenia spectrum, we already found a relationship between how well you can discriminate the sense of self and kind of a, maybe a first indication that people might be more sensitive to this. So I also had the opportunity to do a similar kind of experiment in 22q11 deletion symptom patients. So these are patients who have a deletion syndrome, which increases their chance of psychosis from 1%, which is kind of the overall percentage in the population, to 30%. But here they were adolescents, none of them were psychotic, none of them showed any significant symptoms. And we did a full body experiment, which is kind of similar, in which they had to walk and they were kind of pushing an avatar. Okay, and they had to bring the avatar into this cone. And we kind of altered the trajectory by introducing a different angle. Okay, and they had to kind of walk and push the avatar, make him come into this cone here. Okay, and we asked them each time, same kind of agency question, did this movement shown by the avatar, was it identical what you did? Okay, and we also asked them a confidence question. And with the same participants, we also did a temporal experiment where they walked on a treadmill and the avatar they were watching could actually walk slightly different. So we kind of altered the stride cycle, okay? And we asked them at each point, same kind of question, is this avatar doing what you are doing or not? And what we found is in the spatial dimension, there was a small but significant difference between them. So already these people who do not have any psychotic symptoms, but have a genetic propensity for psychosis, already showed a difference in how well they are able to predict the sensory outcomes of their actions. And this was very, very strongly present within the temporal. So in the temporal, you can see that the healthy participants in blue kind of show this dip. So this is a half stride cycle away. So this is the like your legs are on the other side. Okay. And here healthy participants already are very sensitive and they know this is not them. But the 22q11 ones had a very, very shallow U shape here. Okay, indicating that they were not very good, or even they were very bad at being able to know what's going on between them and this avatar. Questions on these two before we go into full-blown psychosis? Okay. Okay, so of course, the next stage was to go and track people with kind of full-blown psychosis. I'm saying psychosis here because only part of the cohort actually had schizophrenia. We had some schizoaffectives, and at some point, not all of them, we actually knew what's going on with them. Okay, so we just took people who had a acute psychosis, and we did the same kind of experiment, but we asked both an agency and a confidence question here, because we were kind of interested, is this deficit, there are two levels of possible deficits here. One is a first order deficit. So you're bad at knowing or predicting whether this sensory outcome is actually what you've done. But there's another possible problem that might be here. And is that, do you know if you're any good at this or not? Okay, and this can be probed through confidence and metacognition. And of course, this is an important matter because, you know, there are people who are bad drivers, but if they know that they're bad drivers, they're in a much better situation than if they don't know that. And the same thing happens in schizophrenia and psychosis. If you have insight into your condition, your prognosis is much, much better. Okay, so we use the same kind of experiment. Okay, and what we found was quite striking. In both the temporal and spatial domains, while healthy participants in blue showed the typical kind of tuning curve for the self with a clear drop-off in the self-attribution as the alterations became larger, schizophrenics or psychosis patients showed two interesting aspects. One is they were kind of basically at chance. Okay, they were really unable, okay, to recognize when we put in a huge alteration. So 300 milliseconds, healthy participants are at 10% self-attribution, but the psychosis patients were at around 50%. So they were really unable, both for the temporal and for the spatial dimensions, to really make these kinds of judgments. Okay. And interestingly, when we looked at their confidence judgments, we found that there was no real difference, okay, no huge difference between what the healthy participants, the control participants, and the psychosis participants showed. So there's a kind of slightly larger dip, and this is kind of what you'd expect for people who have good metacognitive judgments. So when you can see here that the healthy participants are quite unsure, but the schizophrenics also, the psychosis patients also show a bit of this dip. Okay, but taking into account how bad they are at this task, okay, they're showing very, very high confidence. So they are both bad at this task. They are over attributing the self. So if you're looking at the directionality of this, what these people are saying, well, that's me, that's me, that's me. And they do not really know that they are not functioning well in this task. Okay. And in fact, when we looked at the data, we said, well, could we actually classify who is psychotic and who is not from the slopes, okay, from this kind of tuning curve of self? So we did a very, very simple classifier. We just looked at the slope. We took the mean slope for the group and left a certain number of subjects out. And then for each sample subject, we'd say, well, are you closer to the healthy group or to the schizophrenic group? And in fact, in this healthy controls, we were classifying it at 93%. And for the psychosis patients, it's around 87%. And this was quite robust. Didn't matter how many permutations you did or how many participants you left out. You actually can classify at a very, very high level who has psychosis and who doesn't, just from looking at the slope of how they define the sense of self. Okay, okay, so this is a COVID experiment. Okay, so my student in Bar was kind of stuck with her master's because we had no participants. So we said, okay, let's go back and take all those previous participants and look what's going on with them. And what we were interested in is how previous choices impact the sense of agency. So we know, of course, in perception, there is a really strong impact of what you've decided and seen previously on what you currently sense. And we were wondering if the sense of self, sense of agency, also has this kind of bias. So is it impacted by what you just decided and what you just saw? Or do you have some kind of objective criterion that you're comparing to? So we took two data sets from previous experiments and from some new participants, okay? And you can see the kind of clinical, these are all healthy participants. So you can see this classical drop-off that we see in all our experiments. And the second data set, we had both temporal and spatial alterations, because we were wondering if they could kind of impact each other, or are the temporal and spatial completely separate, okay? And what we did is we built a function which takes into account not only the current stimulus, but also the history, what happened on the previous stimulus, okay? So we have one, which is the stimulus, we have a stimulus beta, and we're also modeling what happened on the previous trial, okay? What kind of stimulus did you see, okay? And we also looked at your choice, what you decided on the previous trial, okay? And we built a function to try to figure out and also to predict people's choices on the basis of these variables, okay? And what we found to me is very interesting and very much in line with what we see in perception, okay? So first of all, your sense of agency, your decision if this is you or not you, depends on what you saw previously, okay? So we're comparing, you can see the beta value for the previous magnitude, okay, is significantly above 0. Okay, and what this means is that when you see a deviation of the self, you're actually comparing, taking into account what you just experienced previously. Okay, so if I see a large deviation after a small deviation, this seems larger to me. Okay, so we're basically shifting our sensitivity, our threshold for deciding if this is not me or not me, based on both the current stimulus, but also our history. And interestingly, the effective response was in the opposite direction. Okay, so if I decided the previous trial, this is me, I'm more likely to say that the current trial is me, and the same for other. So in a way we're trying to kind of persevere, which makes sense in usually in real world where people are not manipulating, this usually may happen due to kind of sensory noise. But in a way, there's a good idea to kind of weigh more strongly on what we've previously decided. So we have two effects in there in opposite directions. One is urging us to compare to the last one, and the other one is taking our choice into account and telling us to kind of persevere and stay with that last choice that we made. Okay. Interestingly, this also crossed domains. Okay, so if I saw a temporally very deviant trial, this would impact me also on a spatial trial, which gives kind of a stronger indication that these two things are brought together in the mind. And despite the underlying sensory processors, which are very different between comparing temporal data and spatial data, they actually impact each other. And this kind of suggests that beyond agency, there's kind of something there which brings all these parts together. And when we're looking kind of comparing these models, you can see that across all subjects, there is very strong evidence for using these models that have history compared to models which just modeled the current stimulus. Okay. Okay, so this is kind of bringing us to the penultimate part of my talk, and this is about how we can actually use these sensory motor signals to change the sense of self. So I've been showing you that, okay, when we give you a deviation of your current actions, you say, well, that's less me. But we were wondering how this could impact, so if we're going to make a change in your sensory motor predictions, if this could impact the self in a more high level way or go to different aspects of the self. And this kind of started work during my postdoc with Olaf Blanke on the feeling of a presence. So the feeling of a presence is a sensation that there's someone behind you, typically on your left side, actually, when there's no one there. And it has been induced by brain stimulation in the left TPJ region. Okay. And we've also seen it. It's often seen, not often, it's rarely seen, but it happens with neurological damage to a specific region. And one of the interesting things about the feeling of a presence is most of these patients, the neurological patients who experience a sense of presence, they say that this presence is shadowing their actions. Okay, so if they sit down, this shadow person sits down. If they're laying down, it's doing the same thing. And this brought us around to think, well, maybe this kind of shadow person behind them is actually a kind of mirror presentation of themselves outside where their real body is. Okay? And we were interested if we could actually induce this in healthy subjects. Okay, can we cause people to have the sensation of someone being behind them? Okay, and these are the regions kind of that in the neurological feeling of a presence group compared to kind of other bodily hallucinations. So you can see they're kind of premotor and insular regions. And then with the help of Swiss and Japanese roboticists, we built this robot. And this robot, what it does is creates a kind of strange sensory motor conflict. So you're tapping in your front space and it's poking you in the back. And this can be either synchronously, so you're tapping and being poked in the same way, or asynchronously, okay, where we put a half-second deviation between the two. And what we found is very interesting. When in the asynchronous condition, you get this kind of strange sensation. Something's a bit wrong, okay? And what happens is when it was synchronous, people thought they were touching themselves. But when it was asynchronous, people reported that it felt like someone else touching them. And they also reported they kind of felt that maybe there was someone there. So this was probed both with questionnaires, and also we did a kind of experiment where we asked people how many people are standing close to them, and we all moved out of the room, and people during the asynchronous condition, participants judged more people to be near them. And well, I will say, so Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist, came once to the lab, and he does not go for any of our illusions. But we put him on this asynchronous for about half a minute. And after half a minute, he got the shivers from this and he could not continue and had to stop the experiment. So if it works on Christoph Koch, I get there's some truth to it. And I took this idea and I said, well, if there's kind of this strange sensation of otherness created by the sensory motor conflict, and we can see in psychosis that they have these problems, maybe this is what's going on. Maybe this kind of noise within the sensory motor system, this conflict, is something that creates this otherness, and this kind of is what's hindering this delineation of self from other. So I took healthy participants in first episode psychosis patients, and we put them on this robot, and they were hearing words in either their voice or another person's voice, okay, while stroking synchronously or asynchronously. And then they had to make judgments if this was their own voice or someone else's voice, okay? And we had patients that had of these first episode psychosis, we had patients who had Schneiderian symptoms of kind of control and those who did not, okay, and some age-matched controls. And what we found is while all of them had this presence hallucination, this feeling of someone else behind them in the asynchronous condition, only those who had kind of Schneiderian symptoms, symptoms of someone controlling them, actually had a problem, okay, in the asynchronous condition. This has caused them to be less sensitive to whether this word was said in their own voice or not, okay? And this is, of course, kind of playing into the idea that maybe what's happening in an auditory hallucinations is this kind of error about feeling whether this internal voice is yours or not yours. We've since done some other very interesting experiments, and in all our experiments, there's something interesting about this asynchronous condition, which causes things to be kind of less selfish, okay? So there's a self-generation effect in memory. So if you're given a word and you complete you say a table and you say chair. So if you make this own connection by yourself, it's called the self-generation effect, and then you remember them later much better. And we did this kind of experiment while people were doing this kind of tapping. And we found that, of course, there was a self-generation effect, but when we looked at people who got the sensation of a feeling of a presence behind them, we found that the people who got this feeling of the sensation behind them, this self-generation effect was smaller in them. So this kind of sensory motor tapping, which causes this arousal of a sensation which is not so much you, causes you to lose this advantage given by producing it yourself. We also looked at thought numerosity. Okay, so we had people kind of try to produce several different words from a word stem, and then we had them think or report how many they produced. And we found that when they were doing the asynchronous stroking, they actually felt that these words were less related to the self. So they misjudged the number of words they produced in the self condition compared to when they just heard them. And recently with Nathan Fevre, we've shown that metacognitive efficiency is actually much, much better in the synchronous condition compared to the asynchronous condition. So again, here, this kind of sensory motor conflict creates a problem in another second level of representation of the self, which is metacognitive efficiency. And finally, just very briefly to look at how this is in the brain, we actually went very old school. and we used instead of a virtual hand, we used a rubber hand, and we used the moving rubber hand illusion, in which you either do the visual tactile, or using kind of very old school connected finger, you use a visual motor. So people are moving the finger and it moves the finger of the rubber hand. This is a very, very strong illusion. And the reason we did it very old school is we did this inside a MRI scanner. Okay, so this is work by Amir Adouf, who did his master's with me. We had 3 different conditions: a visual motor condition where you're moving your hands, you're always moving the index finger. In the synchronous condition, you're actually moving the rubber hand's index finger synchronously. Or we kind of put a bended metal rod, so you're moving the wrong finger. This is an incongruent condition. Or we put a half-second delay between the movement of your finger and the rubber hand's finger. And in the visual tactile, it's exactly the same. And this is kind of like the classical rubber hand illusion, except we also added an incongruent where we're stroking the wrong finger. And we did this within the MRI. And one of the special things we did here is for each block, we did many blocks, we got online ratings. So people didn't just rate this before the experiment or after, but for each time, we got both agency and body ownership ratings from our participants. And indeed, we saw that for body ownership, the synchronous, both the visual motor synchronous and the visual tactile created a sense of body ownership, and not the other conditions. For the sense of agency, you can see that the visual motor synchronous, so when this moves with your hand, you get a good sense of agency. Okay, interesting also from the visual tactile, you get a sense of the possibility to move your hand, and this goes down in the incongruent and asynchronous condition. Okay, and of course we found that these two are correlated, kind of going against the idea that these are different aspects of the self, like we saw in the previous dissociations, but these typically kind of come together and work together. And when we were looking at the brain mechanisms involved, so this is comparing to rest, you can see large swaths of a brain, of cortex, from the visual to the sensory regions. You can see in the visual motor, you have more in the left motor, which makes a lot of sense. And we started to compare the illusion conditions to the non-illusion conditions. So the synchronous creates the illusion. So we found that when you get the illusion, you have a region of parietal and occipital parts which are lit up, which are related to this illusion. But when we compare this to the incongruent condition, in which you're actually moving at the same time, but it's the wrong finger moving, okay, which creates a drop in body ownership but not a sense of agency, we can see this more in frontal and insular regions. Okay. I will scope over the tactile, but I think one of the most interesting things we're already seeing in this project, which is still ongoing, is that there's a large degree of overlap between the systems underlying body ownership and the sense of agency. So we're seeing that behaviorally they come together. In the brain, there's a large degree of overlap between them. But we're wondering, is there one region of the brain which is actually responsible for taking this feeling, well, this is mine because I can control it, in making it into a feeling, well, this is mine, part of my body schema. So we also did an ROI analysis, and I'll highlight 3 important regions, and most of all the SMA, which is we've been focusing a lot on. So within the SMA is the only one who had this drop-off in which the synchronous was different than both other conditions. Most regions show this kind of gradual drop-off in which the incongruent condition was kind of in the middle, sorry. But the SMA showed this very, very strong drop-off. It was very activated when the illusion was induced by the synchronous condition, and much less so for both when there was an anatomical or a temporal conflict. Okay, and specifically this region was the only region which also showed correlations to behavioral ratings, both of sense of agency and body ownership across the whole experimental sequence. So to kind of sum this up, sensorimotor processing is a critical aspect of the bodily self. Okay, in a way, I spent a long time on body ownership, on these correlations, but I think that when it really comes down to brass tacks, when we want to know something about the self, we actually make a movement, because these internal signals are very, very important and very useful for us to make this delineation. We can see that the sense of agency based on these sensorimotor processes is strongly disrupted in the psychosis spectrum. Okay, going from healthy participants in the PQB ratings through 20 TQ11s and finally full-blown psychosis. We can see that disrupting these sensorimotor processing by making this kind of strange conflict, it somehow taps and alters different aspects of the self, how the self in memory or metacognitive aspects of the self. And there are overlapping neural systems that underlie both the sense of body ownership, this feeling of intimacy with I feel this is my body, and the sense that this is my body because I can control it. Right. Do we have time for a few words on the world models?
If you make it brief, because
sure, yeah. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about my new project. It's called Unreal, in which, so after many years working on how the self is modeled, I want to look at how we model the world and what we expect of the world. And the main question we're looking at here is, how do we know what is real? Okay, so we kind of know that colors are real, but some people don't experience them. And we know that rainbows are real, but you can't put them in your pocket. And a lot of discussion about this guy, if he's real or not, and a lot of conflict going on that. So the question is that how do we know what is real in this world, and what in our brain is the system when we experience something which is quite deviant from our model of what we expect in the world, raises a flag and says, well, this is probably not real. And our approach is using virtual hallucination. So we use virtual reality to create kind of a high fidelity environment, and we immerse people in this environment, and we let them feel that this is their new reality. We also tell them explicitly, treat this as your reality. And after a while, what we do is we can introduce deviations from this reality, which are very strongly controlled. And many of these deviations are things we cannot do in real life. For instance, we can reduce gravity, or we can change different aspects of the self, making people larger or smaller, kind of an Alice in Wonderland approach. Okay. And of course, this sense of this making a strange reality is something that we all notice. I mean, we've all had experience and said, well, I don't believe what I've seen. Okay, what does that mean when you say you don't believe what you've seen? Okay, this probably means that somewhere within your model of what you expect of the world, you've experienced a stimuli which deviates strongly from this internal model of what's expected. Okay, so the likelihood is probably kind of outside your priority, what we call a reality prior here. And our idea is that probably somewhere in the front of the brain, we have a representation of what we expect of the world. And this part of the brain is a part which might give us insight when something deviates from that model. Okay, so we're using approach using psychophysics and then phenomenological readings based on JNDs, which we got at the first stage. We've already published one proof of concept paper on this. And we've even started to look at a little bit of fMRI. fMRI is tricky with virtual reality. So here we had people do the experiment outside and we showed them videos inside. And even though this is very preliminary with very few subjects, we've already seen that the visual cortex, for instance, is modulated, okay, strongly by all these conditions. But we found a part of the frontal cortex which is only modulated when we put in a deviation from reality. Okay, so if someone is shrunk or makes something which is different, this region lights up. And despite being very, very preliminary, we're excited because this is kind of the same region which has been suggested for reality monitoring previously, and also for insight in psychosis. So the people with psychosis who have sensation or have knowledge of their deficits actually have a different morphology for this region of the brain. Okay? So this is part of an ERC project, and we're doing both computational modeling with the virtual reality and both 3 Tesla and high field 7 Tesla fMRI, as well as experiments with schizophrenia patients with ketamine. So if someone is interested kind of going down the rabbit hole with us, we're looking for students who are interested in this. Okay. And just to tie things up, this is something which a quote that I really like. So, and I think it's very relevant to what I've said here. So a human being is part of the whole called by us a universe, a part limited in space and time. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. So this is a kind of classical Dalai Lama material, but it's actually Albert Einstein who said this. So I think this is something important for us to remember. It's very important to have the sense of self to be able to work and live and exist in the world. But there's a good chance that it's just an illusion. So don't bank too much on this personal sense of self. So that's it. I'd like to thank the people in my lab who did the work, people in my former lab, which I'm still collaborating with, my funders, and you for this late Friday afternoon talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Excellent. Join me in however you wanna, clap. I usually tend to clap physically because it gives a slightly better sense of self for Roy, in hopefully. So there were a couple of questions halfway that if you want, you can start with those.
Sure.
And then the others will start to think about their questions. So if you want to
open the chat,
tap on those. The first one was from David, who was asking about animals. Do animals have the same bodily self as humans?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. I think that to some level, of course, they have a representation of their body as theirs. And I think this representation is only at the first order. And I mean, this is the reason that most organisms don't eat themselves. Okay, don't eat their feet, because they have some representation in which they know that this limb is part of their own being. Okay, dogs will chase their tails, given that's kind of a funny situation. But I think that they have a very obviously have a representation of what belongs to them. But I think that I would doubt that they have an explicit representation. So probably not a second order representation of this is me, but just kind of this feeling of, knowing that this is and being able to use this body. Okay.
Maybe David wants to sort of, follow up this comment, or maybe it's just that. No? Okay. And the next one was about the, why there's any reason and why the hand in particular is considered not self in somatoparaphrenia.
Okay, that's a very good question. Who asked this question?
It was James Scott. I'm not sure if he's around, but yeah.
Okay, so this is a good question. We don't know exactly, but the hand is very typically the limb involved in somatoparaphrenia. Okay, there have been a few reports for this for the leg, but the hand is most typically the one. So first of all, you have to remember that in stroke, this is a region that's very often damaged. Could just be a statistical region. So these people have hemiparesis or hemiplegia, and they're not getting these signals from the hand. That being said, I think that the hand is also the one limb of our body which has the most degrees of freedom in its representation. Okay, so we can do lots of cool stuff with the hand. We can get many very different representations, and I think unlike the head, where we very typically we don't kind of get to the situations where our heads are mixed up with other people's heads. With our hands, we have a lot of situations where we can see our hands with someone else. We can be holding hands. Surgeons can have different hands within someone's body. So I think this degree of freedom has a part in this feeling that it could belong to someone else. Okay, I have not heard of any case in which someone has felt that their torso belongs to someone else. So I think the kind of bodily itself is centered in that, and the hand has kind of a wider distribution of possibilities of who it belongs to. Okay.
Super. And do you see the last one from the old guard of questions?
So hold on, I've not been able to pick up the.
I'll tell
chat.
you. Okay. Could you do this type of task with facial expression instead of finger movement on hand?
Okay. Once again, because I've opened the chat. So yes, facial expressions. Sure. I'm wondering, do we really have a good representation of our facial expressions in the way we have for the hand? Okay. I don't know, but I've discovered that sometimes people tell me, well, you're frowning. And I said, no, I'm not. Okay. So of course we don't see our face so much. So our visual information is less existent. We have some proprioceptive information about our facial expressions, but I'm not sure we have as strong a prediction of how this is going to look. Okay. So it'd be very interesting, for instance, to do this kind of experiment, have someone smile and show them frowning and see if they can, when you start noticing the difference. But visually, I don't think it's the same because we don't usually see our face so much. Okay, so I think the hand is a much better target for that.
Super. If you can see the chat, there are three in the row. I have to attend a kids incident. I'll be back in.
Okay, for advice, you can wait till the end. I'll be happy to give any advice that I can. Okay. How would paradigms assessing motor awareness compare with task measuring sensory motor performance? Okay. This is interesting. There's just been a study on it, and I don't remember what they found. It's just published a month ago. I think that there's a different level. I think it's important to remember here that there's a very different level of participation, or a different kind of level. When we ask people about their agency, they're basically making explicit judgments about this. Okay. And when people are doing motor corrections, this is in an implicit system that typically works without any consciousness. Okay, so they could be related, but there's no reason that they have to be. And in fact, we found, for instance, for the 20Q11s, we found that they have good motor correction. So when we're kind of making them shift from their trajectory, they're actually correcting, but they're not aware of making this correction. In fact, now I have a student who's doing machine learning on all these finger movements. So we have thousands of finger movements. And we can now see that looking at the finger movements, even on trials when people thought it was them, but they were deviated, which we have a lot of, because let's say 100 milliseconds, we can already see through the trajectory, through the movement trajectories, that despite people not knowing that, or not reporting at least, that there was a deviation, their movement and hence their brain have already showing a change. So we can already see from their movement and classify it over 95% whether there was a deviation or not based on the kinematics. So I'd say that you have an unconscious system related to motor corrections. And at some point, if there's a deviation which is too big, then this is kind of sent up in the hierarchy, and they kind of wake up the boss and say, well, listen, there's something not working out. We really need someone to weigh in here and say what's going on. And then it becomes aware, and it will change your sense of agency and things like that. Okay. Has the rubber hand illusion been done on monkeys? Yes, it has. And in fact, there's even been some work in rats on the rubber tail illusion. Two very interesting papers. There's very interesting electrophysiological data from the non-human primate work, basically showing that it seems to be working the same way. So it seems that kind of frontal and parietals, multisensory regions, are integrating these signals in a way that gives a sense that the monkeys act as if this is their hand. Okay. What effects might high levels of self-objectification have on the sense of self, both body ownership and sense of agency? And do you think this could potentially contribute to sex differences in mental health disorders? Thank you, Emily. That's a very interesting question. So again, self-objectification is already something, hey, Jane, is a part of our explicit sensations. Okay, so how we decide about our body image is already more related to kind of top-down signals and more related to explicit judgments. And in that sense, I'm wondering, and I think this is an open question, whether if I kind of look at myself, if I look at myself a lot in the mirror and I can objectify myself in some way, is this going to change the underlying processing? Okay. Now, of course, we see some mental health disorders who are very strongly related to this kind of sense of bodily self. Of course, in eating disorders, there's all of that. I think there are people here who are more qualified to talk about that than I am. But I would say that at some point, of course, so when you're going and you're looking at these high levels of how I'm treating my body or how I think about my body, these things are going to filter down. They're going to filter down into where I put my attention. And ultimately, I think they're going to affect what I think is me or not me. And there have been some very nice experiments on this using virtual reality and having people who were kind of changing their body image when this body ownership stops being yours because I'm looking too wide or too narrow or too fat. Okay, but that's the extent of my knowledge. Okay, Jane, hey. So you explain feeling of presence and auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia in terms of aberrations of sensorimotor processing and integration. I wonder how you explain the fact that these experiences can be personalized. I made something with FOP in the presence with a threatening male. She thought because of some experience of violence in her past. And auditory hallucinations often have meaning for the patients. Okay. So I think this is a fantastic question. I think what's really going on is that the delineation of self and other is what is damaged here. So I truly believe that, you know, the terminology of the hallucinations, the auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia, they're very personal, okay? And they're quite like what we kind of have in our inner voice. So my inner voice has some person, one person usually, which is me, talking to me and usually telling me I should be doing things differently, okay? Maybe a bit critical. Hope you have a better experience. But if something happened and through some problem in my sensorimotor prediction, this would stop feeling like me. I would probably get the phenomenology, which is very, very similar to what they report in auditory hallucinations. Now, that being said, and this is something very interesting, in auditory hallucinations, from what I've seen, it's very, very rare that schizophrenic patients will personify these voices, okay? It's typically a voice, okay? And they typically do not give them names, while in other psychiatric conditions, we have people who have, you know, like in PD, we have names for these beings or these other feelings. In schizophrenia, this is kind of a voice and somewhat distant. They don't personalize it so much, okay? However, if you have kind of a strange sensation of self, like a FOP, okay, and often these changes in the bodily self, trauma is a very, very strong trigger for changes in bodily self, especially sexual trauma. Since I've been working on this, I've had way too many women approach me and discuss sensations, strange sensations of bodily self in relation to sexual trauma. So I think there's a very, very strong connection there. And I think in a way, these are kind of top down. Okay, so of course, these are kind of dissociative experiences of changes in the bodily self. And not so much ones arising from sensorimotor processes. Okay, so I think, of course, I think these things can arise both from bottom up and from top down reasons. I'd suggest that maybe in psychosis, which has kind of more a genetic element, this is probably more triggered by bottom up reasons, but I'm sure you can also have these same kind of processes and the same kind of problems from top down reasons relating to personal trauma or personal experiences. And then they would probably be more personalized.
Sorry, always interrupting on Zoom. Interesting what you said about the hallucinations in schizophrenia not being sort of personalized. And there was a therapy recently where they sort of created these virtual avatars and sort of helped them to personalize the voices, and somehow that sort of helped them deal with them. I wonder, I don't really know why that works, but it seemed to be helpful.
Yeah, it's a very interesting study. That's actually, I think it's done somewhere in England. I don't remember exactly where. It's an exciting idea of trying to make this kind of so taking this voice and making it something more corporeal and being able to maybe kind of look it in the eye and maybe dispel it in a different way. I think it's a very exciting approach to trying to do these things. Yeah, maybe, I mean, this is kind of a top-down way of circumventing these kinds of problems. But it's a very interesting approach. I think they're going to a clinical trial now, so I'm not sure where this stands as far as evidence-based, but it's an exciting idea. Rick asks, the sense of self can be measured by both subjective report and objective measures like GSR. Do you find any situation where these two measures disagree? Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question. I think we should actually be asking the inverse. We very often find that these measures do not agree, okay? GSR specifically usually does agree. Drift is notoriously variable, so sometimes you get fantastic drift measures. Temperature, I've replicated the finding for full body, but in rubber hand, it's wishy-washy. Sometimes people find temperature differences, sometimes they don't. I think we have to remember that the way these things work is people experience these illusions differently, okay? Some illusions are very, very strong, okay? The moving rubber hand illusion, when you move this is a strong illusion. In fact, I had one person come into the lab and she kind of didn't notice the setup with the rubber hand. And so we were asking, well, are you feeling this illusion? And she said, well, I'm not feeling any illusion because it was so strong, she never thought this was not her real hand. And I think this taps in a lot into what's going on here. So some people have a very strong illusion and you're going to see it in several ways. But these are different aspects of it. So the drift is one aspect and the sensation of kind of identifying with your body is another aspect. And I think that actually going through agency, which is a very much more powerful and potent cue of the bodily self, will bring, actually have better results. And this is why we took this to the MRI. But there's a good reason that you don't have so many sense of agency imaging. Imaging does not like moving so much. So even moving a finger inside the scanner is difficult. And definitely making larger movements is not so compatible with brain imaging. But I think these create much better illusions, much stronger illusions, that we can get better results in the kind of the measurements we make. But yeah, definitely there are different aspects and there are different parts of this experience.
Thanks.
Okay, if the rubber hand illusion works in the same way in rats, this does not call for an ethical regulations about experiments on rats, because they seem to show a sense of self. That's a good question. I think is Matan here. I think Matan is the person to talk to. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of animal experimentation, but I'm not sure that this is a specific marker of the sense of self, because it's more a sense of feeling that, or not a feeling of showing that there is neural processing which differs between the illusion and non-illusion condition. However, I think that, and I think Matan is, I don't know, he's published a paper on this, that if we actually show that, if we're doing experiments on animal and we're showing that they're conscious, or we're asking whether they're conscious, then maybe we should be rethinking about doing these experiments. Because if they're conscious, then these experiments are maybe a little bit cruel. But this is my personal opinion, and you know, I can only live by my own personal opinion. Okay. Daniel, hi. Anorexia patients have a heightened sensitivity to the rubber hand illusion. So would they also have an abnormal response to your temporal spatial asynchrony? That's interesting. It really depends on the reason that they have a heightened sensitivity to the rubber hand illusion. So I think in anorexia, part of this relates also more to the body image, to kind of a high level idea of how I look or how I should look. Okay. And I think that what we're tapping into is kind of more low level body schema aspect, or really kind of looking at, can you match these signals? That'd be a very interesting thing to check. But in a way, I think that I would predict that anorexia patients have more differences related to body ownership and less to the sense of agency, because there's no reason for them not to feel control over this body, but maybe more some level of kind of psychological dissatisfaction with identifying with it. But it's a very interesting question. I don't know any work on that. Thank you. Okay.
I think last tangential question from James, and then Max, and then we can open for whoever wants to ask a question verbally. Otherwise, you know, Roy's going to keep on reading and talking.
Okay. Would you expect trauma in the form of limb loss or paralysis to damn and weaken your prior of bodily self? Maybe also related to change of the body. Okay. So obviously we know we have very strong and prominent data. Amputees have a residual sense of a hand or a leg. Okay. Phantom limbs are a very salient part of losing a limb. So in a way, it shows to me that the representation is less related to actually having these limbs and more related to an internal model of what the body is. So once your body has learned, okay, that it's expecting to have these sensory signals coming from the hand, when they're not there, it creates a strange situation. Sometimes it really fills these in. So it's bringing back the hand, and they have a hand which is there, and this hand is moving, okay? And it's typically slightly deformed. It's a bit smaller typically, okay? So I think that in a way, you're kind of changing the input, you're changing the balance between the actual sensory signals that are coming in and your expectations. But the expectations, the predictions of having this part of your body, which have been loaned over life, are so strong that you're actually inventing, or the brain is kind of building a non-existent hand, which is sometimes very commonly painful or itchy, okay, in the absence of the actual sensory signals coming from that hand. So I think in a way, it talks to the strength of the internal model of the bodily self, and maybe a little bit what happens when the loss of signals are not enough to make us depart from this internal model. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Okay, Max, Do the sense of body ownership and sense of body agency play a similar role in phantom limb syndrome to the role they play in somatoparaphrenia? I'm not sure I understand this. Is Max here?
Unveil yourself, Max.
Yes, that was my question. It was more to do with those interesting experiments you were talking about earlier, to do with sort of over attribution for people with psychotic symptoms. I wondered if there'd been any experiments to look at whether those sort of similar levels of over attribution were found for people with things like phantom limb syndrome as well.
Okay, well, I think phantom limb in itself is already kind of an over attribution of the brain, right? Because you're feeling like the existence and agency. Okay, even though they have slightly less agency, often they say that their phantom limb can be moved volitionally, but also it often moves without them kind of volitionally moving it. You know, it goes into some situation, or sometimes it kind of freezes up for them. In a way, I do not think, however, that this would impact other limbs or other parts of their body. I don't think this would create kind of baseline shift. I have examined this in a small cohort of kind of special amputees, and we didn't see any change. Like in their other hand, we didn't see any difference in their sense of agency or sense of body ownership. So it does not seem that kind of, and we were testing them with and without their prosthesis and stuff like that, the prosthesis you're used to, and we didn't see any changes on their other limbs. So I'd say here that this is probably kind of a localized representation of what they've lost, which is changing, and not a generalized representation of their sense of agency of body ownership.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
We're getting into the point where the people can actually ask questions verbally if they want. I have a few, but I rather let the others talk first. David and Sarah seem to be eager. Go for it.
Want to go first, Sarah?
No, definitely you.
Oh, okay. I mean, Roy, that was a great talk. Very interesting. Thank you. This is a little bit tangential to the talk, but I think it might be quite interesting, certainly for me. But in the work you did in like spatial awareness and spatial understanding, I assume you're looking very much at egocentric space.
Mm-hmm.
But to what extent was there anything that you did that may have pointed to the way in which egocentric space was understood in terms of also of allocentric space? Because the one thing about the generation of spatial awareness over time, of course, lots of reasons to believe it begins with the young child's self. But the development of allocentric space is a very interesting proposition. So I was wondering if there's any interesting connections or disconnections in what you did.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. That's a very interesting and important question. And I'd suggest the following, and I have one study which we did, which kind of looks at it. So all our experience begins from egocentric space, right?
Yeah.
So you go somewhere new, you have this egocentric space, you have something, I've walked from here to here, you have this kind of mapping. And then after a while, if you're good at this, some people are horrendous at this, you can actually create kind of map of what's going on and kind of, but this form of representation already requires different levels of the self. Okay, and indeed, when we look at it, we have a PNAS paper from 2015, when we looked at kind of overlap between these different representations of the self, social self, spatial self in allocentric space, and temporal allocentric self. We saw that within the precuneus, they have an overlapping, there's a part of the precuneus which overlaps, which functions for all these different representations of the self. Okay, but interestingly, it did not map to the same regions we expect for the current bodily self. So there's an interesting kind of reversion here. So when I'm now looking, well, this is kind of a strange medium talk about space, but when I'm looking around the room, I'm experiencing and encoding things in egocentric space. And in my episodic memory, I still retain this kind of episodic and this kind of egocentric information, right? I see you, and this is a relation between where we were. Somehow this is kind of encoded, and through kind of in memory, this will later be retained. And I can imagine you sitting in England and me sitting here, and how I'd fly to England. How this moment by moment representation of the bodily self is encoded and becomes the extended self, is an amazing, super interesting question. Okay, it touches very strongly upon episodic memory, which is in fact bringing back this bodily present self from the depths of a memory. Okay, but we don't really know. I think this is a very, very interesting question that we're going to be addressing in the next few years. How does the moment by moment self become this extended self in memory?
Interesting. So I remember some interesting clinical cases. Take me a while to drag them out from the literature from many years ago, where there'd been a disruption in one but not the other. And so this then showed up in some quite interesting ways in the failure to do proximal tasks, but not distal tasks. And this mapped onto the use of deictic language. So you could talk about here, but you couldn't point out something there, or vice versa. So the connection between the two, I think, is a very fertile piece of ground to look at.
I agree. I think it's a fascinating subject.
Good luck with it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. That was such an amazing series of experiments. I really loved hearing it all together. It was great. So you've already touched on this a bit in terms of psychosis. I'm really fascinated by your psychosis work, but psychosis is such a wonderful collection of so many different symptoms. And you talked a bit about the symptoms these disturbances in self might map onto, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the symptom mapping.
Okay. I must admit, and this is something that when we look at the symptoms of our psychosis patients, so they mapped a little bit to, for instance, the PANS, the positive PANS. Of course, it didn't map into what we pre-registered. They never do. So if you pre-register something you don't believe is going to happen, because you're going to find that. So it didn't map into what we pre-registered, but overall we saw, for instance, that the metacognitive performance is what mapped to the positive symptoms. Now, I think throughout what we're talking about here, we have a much, much better explanation for the positive symptoms, okay? And this is interesting, of course, because the medications are also better at dealing with the positive symptoms than negative symptoms. That being said, I do believe that if you'd come into this confusion and you know, before people are actually treated for psychosis, they have a long period where they're experiencing very, very strange things and no one knows. So typically it takes a few years before people from the beginning, so in retrospective studies, we know that it takes a while, quite a long time, from the beginning of symptoms till you actually see a psychiatrist, okay? So during this period, I think that people often have a very difficult time and they're kind of giving up. So I don't think it explains well. I mean, it would explain well kind of symptoms, negative symptoms like avolition, okay? But not necessarily more affective symptoms. Okay, and I think there's a lot to be done on trying to understand the negative symptoms, which are, I mean, it's always very exciting, and these kind of, you know, these fascinating symptoms are usually positive symptoms, and they're easier to test because people are more proactive. But when they, I mean, you know, when they're going and they're being shown negative symptoms and they are less active in the world, it's more difficult to test them. And in a way we kind of, but these are no less important. And I think the theory still has to improve to explain it. So we at least want to show that they go through a series of positive symptoms, and maybe there's this kind of recession to the negative symptoms. It's a reaction to that. But I don't think anyone has shown this yet. And I think this is a missing part of our theory completely.
Very good. Peter, I see you showing your face, and I see you have an inquisitive mind. Go for it.
Yeah, it's dangerous, that stuff. Thank you, Roy, first of all, for your talk. I wanted to ask, what would you say are the minimum requirements for self, both primary and higher order?
Okay. So I'd say that the recipe calls, first of all, for one body and one mind. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, and I think this is an interesting question. So kind of going to kind of in a brain in a vat kind of idea. So how much do you need this interaction with the world to grow? And I think this is when, you know, I very often get a question about what do you mean by a self model? Okay, what is the self model different from a self? Okay, so to me, the self model, it really arises from the idea that the interaction between our brain and the environment is what gives rise to the sense of self. Okay. And if you'd go kind of to the, you know, the falling man question, someone who kind of, you know, develops it without any interaction, without any sensory experience, they wouldn't have a self. A self is our brain's attempt to make sense of the world in a way that allows us to act in it. Okay, and I think it also has a lot of downsides, right? So I think schizophrenia is kind of one of the downside. It's kind of a, you know, a, a side reaction to having this construct. Okay, and I think that often, and this is related to the questions about trauma, when something really bad happens, we change, this model changes to incorporate that. Okay, but going back to your question, I think what you really need, you have to have a body and you have to have an interaction with the world, because through these things, okay, and through trying to explain what's going on, so the brain kind of is an inquisitive, predictive organ, to try to explain this, the most parsimonious and important delineation you can make is, okay, well, I have this self and there's a world, and once you have that down, you can do all kinds of cool stuff with yourself. Okay, and I think so. So those are kind of the basic recipe: is one body, one mind, and a world to play around with.
Can I bring a provocation, which was brought to me by sort of Oriental thought, because they have many more words than us about consciousness. So some yogic traditions think that cells are conscious because they have a cell wall, an inside and an outside, and a reaction to like interactions. So, okay, they don't have a mind, but you said there is an inside, there is an outside, a representation of what inside should be, which by homeostasis, we're more or less there. Do cells have a self?
So it really depends here now, kind of, where maybe we're stretching what the self would mean to us. So in the sense of what you and I feel as a self, in the sense that if someone would take my glasses and break them, I'd be pissed off. Yeah, so that's one level of self. I don't think they have that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, not true.
Same way that they don't have consciousness. When Damasio talked about the self, you have, I think this kind of, and this taps into kind of Fristonian ideas of what the self is. So I think in a way, any organism which tries to keep some boundaries is in a way, kind of setting down foundations of some kind of selfhood. I mean, it's delineating it from something. I think the human self is delineation from other people in the environment. And kind of the first level of this is making sure that, this whatever is within my skin and maybe a little bit around it is defined as one single entity, and I can act in this entity in the world. If maybe cells are also having a Zangwill talk when discussing their selfhood, but we have no evidence of that.
We'll soon find out, I guess, right? I mean, as soon as I make an invitation, we'll see.
All the cells. Thanks.
Thanks.
I see Reina coming in. Maybe she just wants to show her face, or maybe she has a question.
Hi. Yeah, I wondered because, you mentioned to me like depersonalization before, and I wondered if it relates in any way to like the predictions that we make in the self models, because I feel like, I'm not sure because I don't know much about like the clinical symptoms, but people who experience depersonalizations also have like a bodily disconnect, right, between the selves and their bodies. So I wondered if you know more about like this relationship.
So I don't know if Anna is still here. She's actually an expert on that. So I think this is an interesting question. I've not worked in depersonalization so much, but typically we have depersonalization and derealization come together. I think this is very interesting because what's happening there is actually a sensation of something which is wrong with the body, or a sensation of something which is wrong with the environment, without being able to really define what it is. It's very strong in derealization. You say, okay, something's wrong, but it's not like a hallucination of seeing something changing. So in a way, I think these are tapping in more to the top-down pathway of this, okay? So for instance, ketamine, which is a very strong inducer of a depersonalization, derealization. So people say, well, this is kind of not my body, but they're usually, well, they're kind of clunky, but they're able to act, okay? It impacts body ownership much more than the sense of agency, for instance. Okay, but I think this is very much a top-down route in the sense that, and I think this is why we see this much more related to psychological effects of trauma and psychological effects in anxiety disorders, where people say, well, okay, something's wrong. This is not me. It's not my body. Okay, much less to aspects of agency. So it's, again, much more related to the feeling of, being outside your body or being less identified with it, and less to not controlling it. Okay? Yeah, but it's an interesting question, right? Which we may soon address.
Cool. we are basically, you know, draining you into your night. I'm sure you have to go and have some dinner or something like that, whatever you do in the countries where the you know, the weather is decent. I just wanted you to sort of make a short comment about the relationship between the performance and the confidence in terms of metacognition, meta D, because I see this beautiful sort of dissociation in a couple of experiments, including the schizotypy or schizotypy, I don't know, whatever you say it in English, in the low performance but similar level of confidence that will just change your meta D too. Can you sort of give us a flavor of that? You know, it's people say that they're fine even if they're doing it bad. Are they like drunk people?
Well, what we see when you go down the tree is that the psychosis patients typically do not use the scale very well. They're either super confident that they're right, or they say, I have no confidence at all. There's not much grading going on there. This is also why we were kind of unable to use many of the more fancy kind of metacognitive tools, okay, like meta D prime and all these, because the distribution of the results, especially in psychosis patients, is usually very binomial and very skewed. I have a feeling that they don't really know well what's going on then. Okay, so in a way, they're kind of guessing at this. This is why you get this kind of very strange distribution. And I think it's again much more affected by kind of fluctuations in top-down signals than really having an ability to judge this. That being said, there've been 2 or 3 papers this year from Lefebvre and others showing that psychosis in schizophrenia patients, if you control well for the first order performance, they have intact metacognitive abilities. But this is all for perception. And what we're asking here is above perception. We're asking kind of, this is executive, this is meta-executive property, okay? What do you feel about this sense of agency, okay? So it could be that they have good meta-awareness and meta-confidence, metacognitive performance for perceptual questions. But then when you go up a level and they have to bring this together and they have to also weigh in with their top-down priors about how they interpret this, more kind of towards judgments of agency, then this causes them to be very skewed. And then they're kind of guessing both for their judgments and also for their metacognitive aspects. Say, okay, yeah. They don't really have any idea.
No, this is really good, because that was one of the things I was thinking in the sense of, you know, the whole sort of one metacognitive system for things or several metacognitive systems for performances, right? And you said it exactly like that. So will it be a dissociation if you do a classic perceptual decision-making task versus one that requires a conceptual construct? I'm super curious. I'm not sure if you're planning to do that, if someone is doing it, but I'm super curious about these metacognitive evaluations of who you are versus how you do it, right? It's like
yeah. So I know Nathan Fevre is looking kind of into this kind of thinker, because it was kind of surprising. You know, everyone's talking about metacognitive. You know, it's a classic historical reference that schizophrenics have impairments in metacognition, and clearly they have often a huge lack of insight into their own problems. Okay, but then when you go and look at low-level things, they seem to be kind of fine once it's well controlled. I have now 2 papers coming out in which we show that they have deficits at this high level. So maybe there's indeed a dissociation, like you say, between things that are more low level and then they're kind of simple, you know, Gabor this way or this way. And when you have to bring this together and kind of converge in it with a self-concept, which weighs more heavily on priors and how you look at things from a top-down level, then this becomes more skewed.
Yeah. No, it'd be really good to see some sort of auditory discrimination task versus an auditory sort of presence task, or you know, with metacognition in the same people. Right. But you know, I think Helen came possibly to ask a question, right?
Yeah, I have well, possibly 2 questions, but one was whether there's any work with regards to the self in locked-in syndrome patients, or those who are quadriplegic, or those in minimally conscious state, and what the findings might be from that, because they lack a certain amount of agency, obviously, and metacognitive aspects are also difficult to estimate sometimes. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that's a fantastic question, and I think I mean I have somewhat of a poor answer for this. Okay, so in a way, our theory would suggest that people who have diminished ability to move and to experience bodily sensory sensations would have a very different kind of sense of self. Okay, and for locked in, this is quite possible. I mean, I'm not an expert in locked in, but I do know that for paraplegics and tetraplegics, it seems that they have a very similar experience, not of being a self in the world, which is obviously very different if you can't move, okay? But the internal representation of the self, let's say the second order self, okay, this abstraction of the self seems to be very similar to our own. So if you talk to a paraplegic, tetraplegic person, they don't seem to be lacking a good self mechanisms in the same way that if you talk to a psychosis patient, right? So one way, and I think Sarah's no longer here, one way we think that this might be, I mean, the self is always reweighted, right? You take the sensory signals you have, okay, and you build on what you have there. So, okay, so there's of course a famous patient that lost all proprioceptive afferents and then had a sensation that he doesn't exist until he reweighted and using vision could now get a sense of self back together. So I would say that people who have diminished sensory experiences because of paralysis or other reasons, they're doing a reweighting of the importance of their internal signals, and maybe they're bringing up the interoceptive signals, which you are discovering are very, very important. So our sensation of breathing and our heartbeat, which we don't even record. I mean, the heart, this is something amazing to me. The heart is there from the second week of gestation. The brain evolves around this pulsation. Okay, it's probably very likely that it's a very, very strong model that we have the self around this kind of interoceptive information. And we have done experiments showing that there's a strong link between kind of cardiac activity and sense of body ownership. Locked in is a very good question. I don't know. I'd be very excited to figure out what they're experiencing.
I have one other question, which is very simplistic perhaps, but something that we discussed at home, because you mentioned Metzinger earlier on and your philosophical sort of views as well, and obviously the quote from Einstein. So you have the dual concept of people who, and your work obviously demonstrates that as well, what is minimally required in order to have a sense of self and what happens when it disintegrates in some sense. But what do you think is the boundary between this illusion of a self or wishing to get away from the idea of illusion of a self versus having a psychotic experience where the self disintegrates beyond what we can cope with within the constraints of the world?
Okay. So I think it's a fantastic question. I think that we, since this sense of self first came, the first thing that happened when the sense of self first came upon the first person who had it is he was trying to lose it. Okay, so we mash around, we step on grapes and distill the juices to make something which allows us to escape a sense of self. People take mushrooms and LSD to get a respite from the sense of self. We go to sleep, we imagine, we spend a lot of our time kind of trying to escape the sense of self. And I think sometimes this is very important to kind of forget ourselves. We forget ourselves when you go into flow situations, when we're very engaged in something. And these are fantastic feelings. Okay, people meditate and work hard at it to get a moment's respite of this kind of sense of, especially the higher levels of self, and this mind and imagining what's going to happen tomorrow or what's before. This is all really, really nice when you can choose it. Okay, so I think, if someone would kind of drop some acid into our Zangwill tea before the talk, okay, this would not be a pleasurable experience for us. Okay, we'd be confused and we'd have would be able to come out of this experience. Okay, but I think that being said, we often choose. I mean, the self allows us to survive in this world, and it's very practical. It's really practical to have a representation of where you were yesterday and where your car is when you walk out of the talk, or if you were to walk out of the talk and drive somewhere in this future world, and it's very practical. But then it can also be very disturbing. And I think we might be most relaxed when sometimes we don't, weight these models too much and kind of remember that, the end, they're here to serve us and we should not be serving them. But this is all kind of, this is already beyond science and going into a philosophy.
Super good. I think we've been sort of squeezing you properly so far, and you're about to break a record of length of Zangwill.
Okay.
So we're probably gonna close the questions unless someone had something very sort of poignant, or they can always send you a message. Record themselves asking a question and send you a video. I don't know how many ways there are now to communicate between people. Just to clarify, before we close, and I'll for this one, I think I'll just stop the recording.